So this video is going to be largely unscripted, so it's probably not going to be very entertaining. I have a lot of stuff I've been planning to do. It's not getting done, so for the sake of things, I decided, something is better than nothing. So those of you who get through this video, have the patience to tolerate my lack of variety in voice. Congratulations, you might learn something. But point is, so this past week has come out the film everyone has been waiting for, the remake of Snow White. This is not a review of this film. This is a review of because a lot of people have been talking about Snow White and lately, and Snow White is always, one of the Disney princesses and so forth. There kind of comes a thing I'll come across when people are like, the origin story of Snow White folklore. Some people have one historian or something has theorized that Snow White is based on an actual person, which for that I want personally greatly disagree with. Um, but there's two things that kind of get excluded in this whole Snow White conversation, and so I'm going to exploit the fact Snow White is trending to tell you about that. Alright. So, the first of this is the fact that a lot of people, they're really only familiar with Disney's version of Snow White, and you hear something like, "Oh, the original version of the story is like super dark and very, very morbid," and that's like a really funny to me because there's two things, like I said, that kind of gets excluded. Excuse me, in these. First of off is that, um, as I personally understand it, as someone who has studied Germanic folklore, I wrote a historical fiction heavily based off of this. Uh, there is this, in folklore, there's this fantasy creature that the dwarves touch on, and more specifically, we might know them to be like Black Forest gnomes, um, instead of like dwarves, if, like I said, you didn't know that. And these in turn overlap with another fantasy fairy tale creature that is largely excluded from modern day pop culture awareness. And these are called elves or Alp. Excuse my German. But basically, these are creatures that might come to you in the middle of the night, sit on your chest. They are heavily associated with sleep paralysis. This is actually where we get the term nightmare from, because Nachmar. So the Alp was the male version, the Mar or Mara was like the female version of this. So, like Dutch, northern Germany area, that part of Europe had the female version, while more Germanic area had the Alp. And these creatures were likewise also overlapped with changelings. So the elves would basically were known to kidnap children. They would swap out babies with their own children. And this whole changeling folklore, of course, has its own history and so forth. But the thing to know here is that there's basically, in the woods of Germany, these creatures, fairy tale creatures, and so forth, who were known to take children, or otherwise, if a child ran away into the woods, they might be abducted by the elves and so forth. But eventually, of course, these elves heavily overlapped with dwarves, so elf and dwarves, troots, and elves and stuff. All of these were sort of the same creature. In addition, something that elves and dwarves specifically have in common, elves and dwarves, is the Tarnkapf, the magic hat. This is actually visibly present in both the original Disney's version of Snow White, where the dwarves have those long hats they wear on top of their head. If you look up pictures of Black Forest gnomes, you will also see this hat that they're wearing. And in general, just a lot of Germanic folklore and stuff, like the fairy tale creatures, those long, like fairy gnomes, dwarves, so on and elves and so forth, those long hats that they wear. This hat basically helps them to become invisible. It allows them to shapeshift. If you steal this hat, you essentially get power over them. They're willing to make deals with you in order to get it back, because they are very protective of this hat. And so on and so forth. Also obligatory. Alps specifically are associated with not just sleep paralysis, but epilepsy as well. That's not I don't know how much that overlaps with like the dwarves part, as much as they're heavily conflated. And why do these people want to like kidnap children? What did they do with them? Usually they kept them as pets, or otherwise they kept them as servants. So, kidnap a child, have them clean your house, and so forth. And hopefully this is a little bit more familiar with folks familiar with Grimm fairy tale version of Snow White, where she is basically 7 years old. And this is something that often gets excluded from the conversation of Snow White. People trying to criticizing the fairy tale about how, a woman is forced to clean the house of a whole bunch of men, or there's also slut shaming, and there are fairy tale versions of that where Snow White is older and she is accused of having sex with the dwarves and stuff. But that is, other channels go over that. I'm not going to talk about it. But in Germanic fairy tale version, like I said, these dwarves are sort of kind of overlap with these creatures who are, known to switch children, known to take children, pluck them out of while they're wandering through the woods and so forth. That is just what they do. So in that regard, Snow White being a 7-year-old girl who shows up at a house of a bunch of dwarves, and they tell her, you can stay here, but you have to do our chores and stuff. That should genuinely not be surprising to anyone, because that is quite literally the trope of Germanic folklore. In addition to this, I think we also need to clarify the whole true love's kiss thing. That was made up specifically by Disney. The original, the Grimm's fairy tale version, Snow White is again 7 years old. This is the age where children still believe in Santa Claus. They are very gullible. If they go out for Halloween trick-or-treating and stuff, you have to tell them, don't take candy from strangers. And this is something that happens in Grimm's version of the story. Why? Because she is a 7-year-old child. So, the dwarves basically tell her, don't take things from strangers. And then this happens 3 times specifically, but an old woman shows up, gives Snow White something. Snow White passes out unconscious, and then the dwarves bring her back, old woman comes again. She passes out. Dwarves bring her back. And that third time, that is when she is given the apple. Snow White does learn from her mistakes. So she's kind of fallen twice victim to this gullibility test. So Snow White is, when she's given this apple, she's very hesitant. And so the witch is like, oh, well, you think this apple is poisoned? No, it isn't. Here, let me show you. So Snow White is given a piece of this apple, and the witch takes a piece for herself. She eats the piece. Snow White goes, oh, okay, so the apple is safe. And then she eats the apple piece. And that is, of course, when she passes out yet again. So this time the dwarves don't really know how to help her. So they decide to put her in a glass coffin. It is very specifically stated in the story that a long time passes. So she is... so eventually the prince comes, but she is no longer a 7-year-old girl. Her specific age is unspecified. She could be 14. She could be 20. We don't know. We just know that when she first met the dwarves, when these events occurred, she was only about 7 years old. But anyway, so the prince, of course, sees this glass coffin, and he's like, wow, this is a really pretty young woman. I would like to bring her home. And the dwarves are like, no. But then the prince continues to press. And then finally they just give in. It's like, all right, fine, you can take her. And at no point throughout this entire story does the prince kiss Snow White. How Snow White awakens is the servants of the prince lift up her coffin, put it on their back, proceed to walk along. But because all of this takes place on a mountain and stuff, one of the servants trips, and this causes Snow White to jolt and spit the apple chunk out of her throat. And because of that, she awakens, and then she sees the prince, and the prince sees her, and they fall in love. Now, why that... Oh yeah, and then, of course, yeah, they go after the witch. She has to dance on iron shoes and so forth. That's actually not the most morbid version of Snow White. I will tell you that shortly. But, for the most part, why this is, like, the history of childhood folklore involving children and stuff is excluded in these conversations. Particularly in feminist spaces, because Snow White has been very heavily criticized for being anti-feminist, when, like, one thing I still have yet to hear a single person complain about, what, as I said, Grimm's fairy tale, Snow White is a 7-year-old girl making decisions a 7-year-old girl would make. And then Disney came along, and they took 7-year-old child, and they put this 7-year-old in the body of a 14-year-old girl. I would like to think more people had commentary on that. Why they don't, my only thought is, a lot of people have no interest in the history of childhood. In the history of folklore involving children. This is especially true in a lot of modern feminist retellings. I want to be perfectly clear, this isn't necessarily something that is, like, wrong. I'm not, like, an originalist, so to speak. I do care about narrative evolution, why people, take stories and change them the way they do. This is more of just a difference of opinion and so forth. A lot of women generally do just want to take fairy tales they grew up with and turn them into spicy romances. Instead of, Snow White sleeping with the dwarves or whatever, they want Snow White and the huntsman because, ooh, that's sexy. In contrast to someone like me, I am someone who cares a lot about the history, specifically like child abuse, child exploitation, and so forth. And most people genuinely do not give a they don't care about the history of childhood, of children, and so forth. And as a result of that, doing research about the history of childhood does tend to be very difficult because, of course, having access to this information requires people to care about it, and less people who care, the harder this information is going to be to find. So, that is one reason why I personally care about it, because like I said, most of you don't. There's this sentiment I tend to come across online and in YouTube videos that a fairy tale needs romance in order to be a fairy tale, and this is a great disservice to the great many fairy tales that don't have romances, that you will never get to hear or learn about because they don't have romances, so they are not going to be popular. People are not going to put any effort into learning them, retelling them, and so forth. They're just going to be a niche little corner on the internet for nerds like myself. Brings us to me part 2 of this rant. I said, you're into like Snow White with sex or whatever. This one actually kind of goes into the part of some people saying that Snow White might have been based on a true story, and which is why I personally doubt that, because there is this book that was written by a famous Roman. It's actually not a book, more like a very long poem spanning several books called Metamorphosis. This was written by the poet Ovid. Perhaps you have heard of it. It is one of the most influential works of poetry in Western literature. This, in Ovid's Metamorphosis, there is in fact a story that is very, very similar to Snow White. But not just Snow White, there is also a lot of overlap with Sleeping Beauty as well. If you're familiar with Grimm's Sleeping Beauty as well as Snow White, you will actually see a lot of comparisons between the two. And this is specifically the myth of Khione. Like Khione or Khione. I will try to use Khione as I can. Still working on my Greek pronunciations. And this is specifically, there are several characters with this name in Greek mythology, and specifically in Ovid's Metamorphosis, though, Khione is very specifically, it states, when she was 14 years old, she was very, very beautiful. There were a lot of men interested in her. And not just men too, but few gods as well. Notably Apollo and Hermes. So, pretty much shortly after she turns 14, Apollo and Hermes are like, we gotta get this girl. So, Hermes is a little bit impatient, so he casts his wand and causes Khione to go to sleep. And while she is sleeping, he proceeds to have sex with her. And then Apollo waits until night comes. Khione presumably wakes up by this time. And that night, after Apollo is finished being the sun or whatever, he's referred to Phoebus as in Metamorphosis. But Apollo disguises himself as an old woman, goes to the girl, and they proceed to have sexy time as well. And the consequence of this is this girl becomes pregnant with twins. And she is so thrilled by this, she declares that, she is so incredibly fair. In fact, she is more fair than the goddess Artemis. And Artemis, of course, Artemis, fun fact, being a huntress, was not very happy about this girl saying she is more fair than herself. So she takes her arrow and proceeds to kill Khione. So like I said, here you can see examples of kind of an earlier version of both Sleeping Beauty and Snow White as what would eventually become Grimm's fairy tale versions. Now, I wanted to be clear, this doesn't mean this is a direct ancestor and so forth. There were, ancient Greek versions of Cinderella and so forth. For example, it's an old story. Folklore tends to be very old. If you're writing spicy Snow White stories with consensual romance, I genuinely do not care, okay? This is not bashing on you. But it is, again, just a general disagreement. I don't think that, the evil queen dancing on shoes is the most morbid version, most messed up version of Snow White that exists. That unfortunately goes to Greek mythology, because it's Greek mythology. What happens instead is that there will usually be specific versions of a folklore or a story that just become so incredibly popular it completely wipes out, or this is the version that most people become familiar with at the expense of pretty much everything else. And this is what I personally referred to in my bootstrapping master's degree of narrative evolution as a narrative bottleneck. So, a lot of these stories, there will be a story that is the most popular version, and then versions of that, and then that story will in turn inspire new versions of people specifically off of that story at the expense of everything else. And usually people after this bottleneck, you hear a story once, you're not going to go, I wonder what sort of other versions exist, for example. There are gender flip versions of Grimm's fairy tales and Slavic folklore, but you've heard Sleeping Beauty. Do you care if there's a Sleeping Prince? Probably not. You're not going to go searching for that. You've heard prince turned into a frog. Eastern Europe, it is a princess who is in turn turned into a frog. And these, of course, are things that you are not going to know or really much less care about unless someone specifically tells you, because that is just the way stories work. Yeah, like I said, this is mostly just a rant that is unscripted, and there's probably a point to make. I'm just saying a lot of things I've been wanting to say in an informal format that have just been bothering me, and especially in the world of AI, more and more of that is going to be writing all your essay blogs and so forth. The other day I saw Snow White, AI article about Snow White, how it was written by Hans Christian Andersen. It's a Grimm's fairy tale. Hans Christian Andersen was only 7 years old himself when Grimm's fairy tale was released. And there is part of me that does kind of wonder with how much that might have influenced his own childhood and so forth, his love of fairy tales and stuff. But like I said, most people don't care about the history of childhood. So, yep, we'll see where that takes us from now on.